On this video, I would like to now do the book of Ezekiel. And in this uh, particular video, we'll be focusing on Ezekiel in the sense of the title, authorship, date, historical background, purpose, and then an overall outline and a summary of the flow of thought. So we begin with the title. The book gets its name from the prophet himself, Yehezkiel, which means God strengthens. And as we look at this great book, the authorship, we believe, is Ezekiel himself. And the book of Ezekiel was not seriously questioned as to its genuineness and unity. However, in typical fashion, higher criticism often was eventually placed to Ezekiel as with the rest. In giving a summary of the criticism on the book, Merrill F. Unger writes as follows. As late as 1924, Gustav Holscher complained that the critical knife had been laid on practically all the prophetical books of the canon, except Ezekiel. Accordingly, following the method known from the Jeremiah commentary of Dohm, D-O-H-M, he proceeded arbitrarily to dissect the book, leaving not much more than 1/10 of it to Ezekiel. The comparatively few rhythmical sections, plus part of the visions in 1, 8, 9, and 11, 24 to 25, and part of the narratives in chapters 4 and 5. The rest, the prosaic parts, he assumes to be the actual work of the real authors of the book, supposed to have lived in the 5th century. V. Herndrich, although essentially rejecting Holscher's thesis, follows with the same approach to the book as does W. A. Irwin, who rejects chapters 40 to 48 entirely and accepts as genuine only about 250 verses of the rest. C. Torrey, 1930, rejected the authenticity of the book, representing it as a pseudo apocryphal writing of Palestinian origin to be dated about 230 BC. In Messel, 1945, advocates a similar approach, placing the book also in Palestine. But sometime after the period of Nehemiah, about 400 BC, A. Benson says the book as it now stands is no authentic work of the prophet Ezekiel. In reading the preceding critical opinion, one cannot help but notice the utter confusion and contradiction among these various men, since it is based upon the subjective, imaginative fancies of men. Negative criticism such as this can only end up in this light. The book of Ezekiel, however, is perfectly genuine, and there are a number of good reasons for supporting the authorship of Ezekiel as Ezekiel himself. Some of these reasons can be summarized as follows. Number one, the book contains the name of Ezekiel as the prophet in 1:3. Two, the book is clearly autobiographical and the first person singular is used throughout. And then number 3, unity and similarity of thought of the entire book make it clear that the book is from one mind. And finally, many of the prophecies are dated and localized in the time of Ezekiel, that Ezekiel lived. So I have no problem seeing Ezekiel as the author of the entire book of Ezekiel. As to date, Ezekiel began to prophesy in the 5th year of Jehoiachin's captivity. We see this in 1:2, which would be about 592 BC. The last recorded date of his prophesying is in his 27th year. This is found in chapter 29, verse 17, or in 570 BC. Hence, with what is recorded, Ezekiel's ministry then covered 22 years from 592 to 570 BC. As to the historical background, the background for Ezekiel goes back to Ezekiel's time, and it's the same as Jeremiah's. The main difference between the two prophets, however, is the place of their prophesying. While Jeremiah remained in Jerusalem and did his prophetic work until the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC, Ezekiel was taken captive in 597 BC, and in which was the second deportation, there were 3 of Babylon deporting exiles from Judah. Exiled in Babylon, his home was at Tel Aviv, the principal colony of the exiles on the river Kibar. His ministry began in the 5th year of Jehoiachin's exile in 592 BC and extended to the 27th year in 570 BC. And I would refer one to chapter 1, verse 2, and chapter 29, verse 17. From 592 to 586 BC, before the fall of Jerusalem, he concentrated his message to the exiles in Babylon, whereas Jeremiah was working in Judah, reminding them that the Lord would certainly judge the city and the temple in a coming devastating judgment. After this occurred, he then becomes a consolation to the exiled Jews at that time by announcing a future day of restoration in which Israel would be regathered, redeemed, and restored to their land under the magnificent reign of their King Messiah, which I believe refers to Christ. A new temple, city, and worship would again be renewed and carried on. And there's debate about that, whether we're looking at a future millennial temple or eternity. I personally refer it to eternity in Revelation 21 and 22. The purpose of Ezekiel's ministry and prophecy was to communicate to his exiled captives the fact that it was their own sinfulness that was bringing judgment. He sets forth their personal responsibility and God's sovereignty in justness in bringing them into captivity, while his fellow captives still felt that the temple and city would not ultimately be destroyed. How can the temple be destroyed, was their thinking. He had the task of showing them the irrevocability of these judgments and the reason for them, much like Jeremiah again. except he was working from Babylon. In addition to this, it was also his purpose to announce the inevitable judgment of the various Gentile nations surrounding Israel, and to reveal the glorious restoration of Israel at the advent of the Messiah, or in New Testament, we believe, of Christ. So as we look at the overall outline to the book, we have prophecies against Judah and Jerusalem in chapter 1 through chapter 24. We have the introduction, the commission of Ezekiel. We have the vision of the prophet and his commission, and then the prediction of Jerusalem's overthrow in 4 through 7. He then announces the Babylonian invasion in 7, and he then comes to the sin of Jerusalem in 8 through 11, looking at the temple idolatry, the image of jealousy in 8, the worship of Osiris, of Tammuz, and the worship of the sun. And all of this is found in 8. Then he sees the vision of the glory departing, the vision of Jerusalem's being judged in 9, and then the glory departing after that from the threshold to the east gate, and then finally leaving. And by the way, the rabbis said the glory would come back when Messiah would come, which in the New Testament is applied to Jesus. Then there's the absolute certainty of Jerusalem's overthrow in chapter 12. This is followed then by announcement of through different messages of judgment in 12 through 14. And we see a message, for example, of the idolatrous elders, the announcement of judgment through allegory in chapter 15, the announcement of the allegory of the faithless wife being applied to Israel in chapter 16 by Ezekiel. And then there's further messages in 18 to 22. The message of divine dealing and individual responsibility in 18. 18 is an amazing chapter on individual responsibility. This is then followed by another review of the unfaithfulness of Israel as Ezekiel is developing it in Egypt, in the wilderness, in Canaan, and how there's going to be this indictment of judgment from Nebuchadnezzar. And this carries us through chapter 22. And then there's the announcement, further announcement by allegory of Aholah and Aholibah, looking at the northern and southern kingdoms and their judgment, these two sisters, as it were, followed by the sign of the boiling pot and the sign of the prophet's own wife. This is followed then in 25 to 32 by prophecies against foreign nations, against Ammon, for example, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, against not only Tyre, but against Sidon, against Egypt. They're all prophetic enunciations against these particular nations or peoples. This is followed then by the prophecies of Israel's final restoration in chapter 33 to 48. Israel will be brought back to the land, and there will be a prophecy concerning false shepherds and true shepherds in 34, a prophecy against Edom and her sins and her judgment, and then on talking about Israel's future restoration. We see in this a great prophecy of the true shepherd, David, which has its fulfillment in New Testament theology to Christ, especially in Matthew. Then we see Israel's future restoration in 36 to 39. We see the vision of the dry bones in 37 coming together and having life. And we see two sticks, the reunification of Israel and Judah. All of this in chapters 37, 36, and 37. And then we have the prophecy of Gog and Magog, which seems to look at the final judgment at the Lord's second advent in Revelation chapter 20. And then there's the settlement in the land, the vision of the temple, its specification, its worship, and what the land will look like. And there's debate on where that fits. Some put it in a millennium, appealing to Revelation 20. Others see it referring to eternity, that the vision here has its application in Revelation 21 and 22, and Gog and Magog, the final judgment in 20 of Revelation. As we look now at just talking our way through each section, the theme of the book of Ezekiel is the captivity of the children of Israel and their glorious restoration. The book of Ezekiel, as we said, may be divided into three parts: prophecies against Judah and Jerusalem, 1 to 24, prophecies against foreign nations, 25 to 32, and prophecies of Israel's final restoration, 33 to 48. The book begins with a brief introduction in which the vision and commission of Ezekiel are given in chapter 1. This is an amazing picture. The time and place for the vision is stated, followed by the vision where Ezekiel sees the glory of God in the vision and which becomes preparatory to his commission. Sort of like the Holy of Holies becomes God's chariot, whereby it can go in every direction. The glory of God in this highly symbolic vision of chapter 1. Having seen God's glory, the prophet then is given his commission in 2, and how he is prepared for it, and what his mission and responsibility is in chapter 3. This is followed by the prophecies that are uttered against Judah and Jerusalem. As we've seen, first of all, the overthrow of Jerusalem by Babylon is predicted in chapters 4 through 7. This is predicted and interpreted through various symbolic signs. The sign, for example, of the tile, the sign of the prophet's physical position, laying on one side and then on the other, the sign of famine, the sign of the shaved head and divided hair, all speak of coming judgment in chapters 4 through 5. These signs are then explained how that because of Israel's idolatry at that time, the Babylonian invasion is talked about in 7, and the horrors of it are expressed. The sin of Jerusalem is next seen, furthermore, as Ezekiel receives vision of Jerusalem's sin and the departure of God's glory. Jerusalem's temple idolatry is first mentioned in chapter 8, with its idolatrous worship of the image of jealousy. Osiris was worshipped, a pagan divinity, and Tammuz. The sun was worshipped. All of this is in 8. After this vision, then, another setting down of the Lord's judgment against idolaters is seen in the judgment that would come with the Babylonian invasion. Because of Jerusalem's disobedience, the prophet sees the glory of God then departing. And we see this in chapter 10. It goes from the cherub to the threshold, from the threshold to the east gate, and finally completely out of Jerusalem. And it's interesting, as we said before, this became in rabbinic thought, a thought was that when Messiah comes, the glory will come back. And of course, my mind goes to John 1, where John says, we beheld his glory. Glory as of the only begotten Son of God, of the Father, full of grace and truth. So the glory came back, John has said. It's an old man writing the Gospel of John. With all of this going on, though, the prophet has a vision of Jerusalem's coming judgment after the glory departs. That judgment is described in 11, along with a declaration of the final glory of the Lord having departed as the inevitable sign of coming judgment. In the midst of that, there is the promise of restoration in 11:14 to 21. Furthermore, after predicting Jerusalem's overthrow and having described the sin of Jerusalem, the prophet speaks of the absolute certainty of the overthrow under the Babylonian captivity. We find this in 12 through 24. This is first of all announced through signs that he performed in Babylon. The sign of removing baggage, looking at an exile coming. The sign of trembling give a visible illustration of coming judgment in chapter 12. These signs are followed by a message announcing Israel's same fate. The message of certain and imminent judgment are given to a message against lying prophets and prophetesses who said it wouldn't happen, and a message against Israel's idolatrous elders in 14. Israel's elders were in the lowest depths of idolatry, Ezekiel says, and the judgment to fall on them was therefore inevitable by the Babylonian invasion. Not only are signs and plain messages used in announcing Israel's doom to Babylon, but allegory is also used in 15. There is the allegory of the vine, which Israel is pictured by Ezekiel at that time as a useless vine, which is really not bearing fruit. This is followed by the allegory of a faithless wife. She's been faithless, Ezekiel says, to the Lord. This traces Israel's past, present, and future unfaithfulness in chapter 16. And furthermore, the Lord had formally taken care of Israel, and over against that, Ezekiel writes about her present infidelity. And as a result, the divine judgment to follow and the enormity of this iniquity that he sees. The allegory then concludes, which is on a positive note, by giving Israel's future restoration in chapter 16. The third and fourth allegories in this series are the allegory of the eagles and the allegory of the cedar. The allegory of the eagles picture Nebuchadnezzar and his defeat of Zedekiah, who has been trusting in Egyptian security, while the latter allegory sets forth the hope of Israel's future restoration through the Messiah when he comes. Furthermore, the announcement of judgment continues through further messages in 18 and following. God's justice is defended as his divine dealing, but in the midst of it, we have a great passage on individual responsibility. Every individual has the freedom to respond in obedience or disobedience. So it's a great chapter on the freedom of the will. Because of this judgment, Ezekiel also gives a message of lamentation in which he laments for Israel's leaders at that time. Jehoahaz in 19 is lamented, and Jehoiachin, as well as for Israel's land. The prophet then further vindicates the justice of the Lord in dealing with Judah at that time by reviewing her unfaithfulness in 20, her infidelity in Egypt in 20, and in the wilderness and in Canaan. So he gives sort of a historical tracing to show that as to why the judgment from Babylon is inevitable. Because of her sins, the prophet reiterates the coming judgment in his message concerning the sword in 21. The Lord's sword is first seen in the sword of Nebuchadnezzar. The one who would actually be God's means of judgment is then discussed. The message is followed by another, which gives a clear indictment of what's going on in 22. Judah's sin at that point, sins are enumerated in 22. Her judgment again is enunciated. And furthermore, all are included in this. The priests are guilty in 22. The princes, the prophets, and the people are all included in this message of judgment. The major section of the book then concludes by announcing the theme of judgment again. This is going on again and again by means of an allegory and sign. The allegory of Ohalah and Oholibah give the picture of judgment on both Samaria and Jerusalem. The sign of, in other words, they represent the judgment coming upon these two sisters, so to speak, Samaria and Jerusalem. Samaria had been judged by Assyria, and now Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. The sign of the boiling pot pictures the imminent destruction that would come under Nebuchadnezzar of Jerusalem at that time, and the horrors that would accompany it in 24. And finally, the prophet was told to mourn, was told not to mourn over his wife's death as a symbol of the coming judgment and the results that it would bring. Ezekiel 24, 22 to 23, for example, reads, "And you shall do as I have done. You shall not cover your lips, nor eat the bread of men, and your turbans shall be upon your heads, and your shoes upon your feet. You shall not mourn nor weep, but you shall pine away for your iniquities, and mourn one toward another." The mourning is because of the iniquity and the coming judgment. The second major section of the book is next considered, in which prophecies against foreign nations are now given. This is 25 to 32. We see judgment announced against Ammon, for example, in 25. Moab as well in 25. Edom, Philistia, in all in 25. The judgment on Tyre, and which at the time we see a discussion of Tyre's fall, which some have applied in the New Testament to a type of Satan and his fall. And then judgment against Egypt in 29. The announcement of Egypt's destruction at the time, the instrument of her defeat, are all discussed in chapter 30, followed by a lamentation over her and her king in 31. And that judgment was fulfilled following Nebuchadnezzar's invasions in 572 and 568 BC. So the final major section then of the book moves from the picture of judgment to Israel's final restoration in 33 to 48. The prophet's duty is set forth in 33. He's a watchman and he needs to be faithful, and it's not an easy task. And that would be true of ministers today, are to be watchmen on the wall. And it's not always easy to speak the word of God. A prophecy is then given regarding false shepherds, in contrast to the true shepherd of Israel in 34. And to me, this is a beautiful text that I think is pointing to David that Christ fulfills. The false shepherds are indicted in 34, and their judgment is stated. The work and role of the true shepherd is then discussed. He will protect the people, rule over them, and bring peace to them in his reign. This is all in 34. And I see Matthew seeing Christ as the final David. Actually, the name David means 14 in Hebrew. Daled is 4, Bob is 6, Dalet is 4. And if you do a gematria and add that up, you end up with 14. And Matthew says there's 14 generations from Abraham to David, David to the Babylonian captivity to Christ. And I think it's clear there that he's using 14 in the genealogy of Matthew 1 to point to Christ as the one who is expected and who is coming, culminating in his incarnation as the God-man. Before discussing the actual restoration of Israel, though, he stops to bring judgment on Edom, and this is described in chapter 35. The restoration then of Israel to her land is next dealt with. The nations living at the latter time will be judged in 36, and Israel will be restored to her land. We see this in chapter 36 as God's converted people. As he looks at this, he looks at the vision of dry bones and all these bones coming together and flesh being put upon it. And he looks at two sticks coming together. That is, Ephraim and Judah becoming one. The vision of the dry bones then is a picture of Israel's national and spiritual reinstatement of God's chosen people in kingdom blessing, while the sign of the two sticks, as we've said, speaks of the reunification of Israel and Judah in 37. And finally, the restoration of the Davidic throne in 37. Chapters 38 and 39 have a remarkable prophecy of Gog and Magog. In this great prophecy, both the attack of Gog and his defeat are discussed. And the Lord himself will bring the defeat, and he will be magnified in the victory. The victory of the Lord is followed by a picture of massive burial. And there's a big debate on what Gog and Magog is talking about. Some take it to be after the millennium. Those who follow Revelation 20 as a literal millennium will see Gog and Magog after that. Others apply it to eternity, that final defeat of sin, of Satan, of the demons, and the glorious resurrection that is to follow for believers in the Lord Jesus, which is preceded by the final judgment. But then, depending on how you interpret that, from chapters 40 to 48, Ezekiel's vision concerns the land. We see the temple in 40 to 43. We see its worship, and then we see the land. Concerning the temple, its vision is first of all stated in 40 with specifications of the temple itself proper. This is followed by the chambers for the priests in 42, and the purpose of the temple is then seen in 43. It will be used in providing a dwelling place for the Shekhinah, the glory of God, in providing a center for divine government and for sacrifice. There's a big debate on all of this. Some believe that in the millennium there will be a rebuilt temple with animal sacrifices reinstated again that will become almost like a picture of the sacrifice of Christ. Other interpreters say, no, we understand from the New Testament by one sacrifice forever, he did away with animal sacrifices. And they were just shadows pointing to the reality. So that Ezekiel, who is highly symbolic, like we saw in chapter 1, others will say this is talking about eternity. The idealized worship under the imagery of temple sacrifices, but depicting the final glorious worship and final sacrifice of Christ in that new Jerusalem, in a new heaven and new earth. Concerning the worship, the ministers of the temple are then described. The portion that is given to the priest and the prince is discussed. This is all in 45. And the discussion of worship ends with a short treatise on the actual worship of the prince and the people. Again, how literal is one going to take this in light of Ezekiel's own symbolic use, often an illustration in his writings? And that's why some would say this is simply an amazing picture of idealized worship under the imagery of temple worship that's actually actualized in a new heaven and new earth, in that final perfect worship which Christ brings to the church in eternity. The book then ends by briefly treating the land. It discusses the river that flows out of the sanctuary, the borders of the land, and the division among the tribes, priests, Levites, and prince. That's in 47 to 48. And again, one's mind goes to Revelation 22 and 21 and 22, where we have the tree of life, and then we have the river of life that's seen there. And that would be, it looks to me like John's application of Ezekiel's wonderful symbolic vision here in a new heaven and new earth. So I'm going to stop with this. I'm amazed at the messianic anticipation of the ideal David, which has its reference in the New Testament, I believe, to Jesus in Matthew, chapter 1 of Matthew. And again, Ezekiel is a highly symbolic book, and I'm wondering if even the writer of Revelation, John, does not draw a lot of his apocalyptic style of writing going back to the kind of symbolism that Ezekiel often uses in his great prophetic book.